from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And featured today, a review of the just-released 2018 Kansas Wheat Variety Performance Test Report from K-State, which evaluated scores of wheat varieties at 19 locations across Kansas. K-State's Jane Lingenfelser will join us to highlight the varieties that topped the yield chart region by region, as well as the varieties which have a track record of standout performance in each region. And Jane will further break down the report by looking at the top 5 varieties by acreage in 2018, how they performed. And following the agricultural news headlines of the day, K-State's Charlie Lee will look at the rebound in swift fox numbers in the High Plains. All that here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
We're glad to have you tuned in for another Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. And this first half hour for you wheat producers, as that information you await this time every year is now in. The K-State summary of wheat variety performance from the various trials around Kansas here in 2018. With us once again is the agronomist who oversees the crop performance tests for K-State's Department of Agronomy, Jane Lingenfelser. This is in the form of the Wheat Seed Book, as it's called now, Jane, and it is available at the moment, depending on how you want to go about getting it, right?
That's right. And this book contains the results of the wheat performance tests and also the directory of certified seed dealers from the Kansas Crop Improvement Association. And this will all be available in the 2018 Wheat Seed Book. It will come out as an insert in the High Plains Journal magazine. And there will also be a flip book available for digital subscribers to a High Plains Journal. And I unfortunately don't have a date for that, but I understand that it will be coming out as an insert soon, and then it will be in county offices after that.
So be watching for that. Or if one would like to have a look at the electronic version, they can go online right now for that, right?
That's right. The individual location results are already available on our website, and that address is agronomy, that's agronomy.kstate.edu. And an electronic version of the book will be found at the K-State Research and Extension Library. That address is ksre.ksu.edu/bookstore. And this version doesn't have the certified seed directory, but the seed directory can be found at the KCIA website. That address is kscrop.org.
The scope of the test this year, how many locations did you feature?
We started out with 21 locations. Those are organized into 9 different geographical regions with different climate and management practices. And today I will present the results of 19 of these locations, as 2 of them were ultimately abandoned.
Jane, right to it, if we might, the regional yield summaries. And what you've done here is gone region by region in the state and identified those varieties which have shown well in those locations, not only this year, but in recent years. And once more, it's not an exclusive list. You want to remind folks of that.
That's right. And another silver lining from this year, if we can call it that, is that we don't usually have drought stress, heat stress, and cold stress in the same year. And as brutal as it was for producers, it also was a very good selection tool. And so I will mention the top yielders, as I do every year. But I noticed in doing that the top yielders this year weren't the same as last year. So I would highly recommend that everyone take a look at all the resources about wheat varieties that they can find in the region.
Well, let's make our rounds throughout the state, if we might. In northeast Kansas, well, you had one test location when it was all said and done.
Actually, we just have the one in Manhattan in northeast Kansas. The average for Manhattan was 47 bushels. That's down about 40 bushels from last year. But the top yielders in Manhattan SY Grit from AgriPro did well. Also, WB Grainfield from Westbred, and Larry from Wildcat Genetics. And in previous years, AG Gallant from AgSeco has done well, and also Gallagher from Oklahoma Genetics has done well in the Northeast region.
As for Southeast Kansas, you had 2 locations to look at there.
That's right. We had Ottawa and Parsons. The average across those locations was 45 bushels. And our top yielders in the Southeast region, LCS Chrome from Lima Grain did well. Also WB 4515 from Westbred, and an experimental variety from Cropland that was EXP 26-16 did well in the Southeast region. And our historical top yielders, Hot Rod from AgSeco, LCS Chrome from Lima Grain, and Ruby Lee from Oklahoma Genetics have done well.
Well, moving up then, Jane, to the north central part of the state at 2 test locations. Again, not the greatest average yield, but it wasn't awful either.
Right. We ended up with 37 bushels for Belleville and Beloit. This year, our top yielders, AM Eastwood from Agrimax did well. Also, Lone Rider from Oklahoma Genetics. WB 4458 from Westbred did well. And in previous years, AG Robust from AgSeco has done well. WB Cedar from Westbred and Zenda from Wildcat Genetics have done well in the north-central part of the state.
Then you look at central Kansas at 2 locations, and the bushel average bumped up a little bit there.
It did. In our central region, we had 53 bushels as an average. That was from Gibson in Saline County and Lorain in Ellsworth County. And Lorain, we also had the intensive management trial that is managed by Dr. Romulo Lolato. I will talk about it in a second. But our top yielders for the standard performance test at Gibson and Lorain, LCS Mint from Lima Grain, an experimental from Oklahoma Genetics. It's OK 12716 did well, and an experimental from Colorado Plains Gold, CO 13D1783 did well in the central region. In the past, our top yielders there have been AM Eastwood from Agrimax, Bentley from Oklahoma Genetics, and SY Monument from Syngenta AgriPro, and WB 4303 from Westbred have done well in the central region.
South central Kansas, and again, an intensive management site there as well, but you had 3 overall test sites, right?
We did. We had Moundridge, Hutchinson, and Conway Springs. There were intensive management trials at Moundridge and Conway Springs, but the average for the standard test was 42 bushels. Our top yielders in the south central region, LCS Mint from Lima Grain, Langan from Plains Gold, WB 4515 from Westbred, and the experimental from Cropland, EXP 26-16 did well. And in the past, Gallagher from Oklahoma Genetics has done well. Also Paradise from Polanski and Larry from Wildcat Genetics. And as I said, there was the intensive management trials. In addition, either at Moundridge or Conway Springs, there were no gains in double digits at either location. It was about a 1 bushel advantage at Moundridge and 3 bushels at Conway Springs. Again, because of the lack of disease, not too much to compare.
Well, Jane, as we move into western Kansas, and noting some acreage was abandoned because of the horribly slow start to the crop, but we also see some pretty impressive and surprising yield numbers out there, starting with Northwest Fallow.
That's right. Northwest Fallow, we had Tribune, Colby, Hayes, and Decatur. The average across those locations was 48 bushels. Top performers at the Northwest Fallow region, Tatanka from Wildcat Genetics, Lone Rider from Oklahoma Genetics, the experimental from Kansas, it's KS14H 180-4-6, and the experimental from Plains Gold, CO13D1783, did well. And in the past, Tatanka has done well in the past, and LCS Pistol from Lima Grain, Long Branch from Dynagro, and TAM 114 from AgSeco have done well in the Northwest Fallow region.
And in southwest Kansas, again, that yield number was eye-catching, and for once that area of the state received some rainfall to help the crop along.
They did. Larned and Mullenville started out with fairly good establishment. They did have some moisture in the summer. Garden City, however, had that spotty rainfall throughout the growing season and was ultimately abandoned, leaving us with an average of 66 bushel for Larned and Mullenville. And our top yielders in the Southwest, Larry and Oakley from Wildcat Genetics, WB Grainfield from Westbred, and LCS Mint from Lima Grain did well. And in the past, the same varieties have done well. Also, TAM 114 from AgSeco, Long Branch from Dynagro, SY Monument from Syngenta, and T158 from Lima Green have done well in the Southwest region.
And in western Kansas, 3 irrigated wheat test sites, although you had to give up on one because of a hail event?
That's right. We had to give up on our location in Healy, which had a very large hail event right after heading. We were left with Garden City and Colby. The average for these 2 locations was 88 bushels. And our top yielders in the irrigated region, Lone Rider from Oklahoma Genetics, T158 from Lima Grain, and Long Branch from Dynagro did well in the irrigated tests. And in the past, the same varieties plus Underwood from Dynagro, SY Flint from Syngenta, TAM 204, the beardless wheat from Watley, has done well, and Oakley CL from Wildcat Genetics has done well in the irrigated tests.
Jane, we want to take a quick break here and then return, for you've broken all the data down in another way, looking at the top 5 varieties of wheat seeded here in 2018 and how they did from a statewide perspective. Also, the state-by-state lines we find from Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Nebraska and how they did. Jane Lingenfelser is the agronomist in charge of K-State's crop performance tests as we're going over the just posted 2018 wheat variety performance test report. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. We're back now on this Agriculture Today. Again, during our first half hour, we're going through the highlights of the just-released 2018 Kansas Winter Wheat Variety Performance Test results. They are in the form of the Wheat Seed Book that K-State puts out every year. Jane Lingenfelser is across the way once again. As you know, Jane is the agronomist in charge of the crop performance tests for the Department of Agronomy each year. Just to tie up a loose end from the first part of our conversation, Jane, you mentioned these special intensively managed wheat variety evaluations at 3 locations at Lorain, Mound Ridge, Conway Springs this past year. You might outline what those entail.
Sure. It's the exact same variety set as the regular performance test, but it has an additional 40 pounds of nitrogen and 2 fungicide applications. This year, there wasn't much gain from the intensive management, probably because of the lack of disease. The average gain was about 7 bushels, and the biggest gain was 17 bushels for an experimental from Kansas. It was KS14HW 106-6-6. If you have questions about the cost-benefit of adding additional inputs in your wheat production, this is really an excellent comparison of common and new varieties, and it is available on the 2018 Wheat Book and on the website.
So look into that new information, which is additional to the conventional variety performance information. Well, Jane, looking at the variety performance numbers from a different angle, that is by the top 5 varieties that we saw planted for the 2018 crop sown this past fall. Really, we get into some very familiar names here, don't we?
That's right. And again, these are the top 5 varieties that were seeded in 2018, according to Kansas Ag Statistics. And our number 1 variety for the past 6 years is Everest, and that accounts for over 9% of the state's wheat crop. I can only talk about how Everest and the other varieties performed in the performance test this year. But this year, Everest yielded a very consistent 95 to 96% of the test average. So not the best, but very consistent. Our number 2 variety, SY Monument, it was best in the tests in the southern half of the state. It was slightly below the test average in the northwest, north central, and the northeast trials this year. Number 3, Lima Grain T158. It did really well in the northwest, and it was average in the southwest regions of the test this year. Number 4, WB Grainfield. It was mentioned as a top yielder in the northeast and southwest tests, and it was planted across the state and did well except for in Hays, where it was uncharacteristically poor. I mentioned there was a hail event in Hays that caused some shattering, and I think it really affected Grainfield. It's a little bit later variety and may have just been at the wrong stage of development for a hailstorm. But other than that, WB Grainfield did well in the performance test this year. And number 5, Winterhawk. It did best in the central tests, Gibson and Lorraine. It was below to slightly below the test average in the other trials this year.
And the point is, these wheats have staying power. Several of them have been in that top 5 for quite a few years running now. And there's a reason, because they are consistent.
That's right.
You also have a breakout of the data along the state lines, if you will, state by state, for your test does take in varieties not only from the Kansas program, but from Oklahoma, from Colorado, and one from Nebraska this year, and we want to touch upon those. You've already mentioned Everest as the lead dog in the Kansas lineup, but there are several others that have shown well as well.
That's right. 1863 has consistently yielded about 93% of the test average. Also, Canmark. Canmark did best in the irrigated trials this year. Oakley CL was above average in the western test, and I mentioned it as the top yielder in the southwest region of the performance test this year. Larry, that was above average except for the central region. It was the top yielder in the southwest. Zenda was average to above average everywhere except in the southeast, where it did slightly below the test average. Tatanka, this year, it extended into the north-central tests, where it was slightly below the test average, but it was the top yielder in the northwest region. The white wheat Joe did well in the southwest region of the test. And I don't usually talk about experimentals, but this year I think it's worth noting the experimental KS14HW 106-6-6 did well in the South Central test. I believe I mentioned it as a top yielder.
That may be the next significant release out of the breeding program at Kansas State University. Yes. Be looking for that with a new name, hopefully, to make it easier to remember. The lines out of Oklahoma, and so many of these have caught on well in the southern reaches of the state and even beyond in some cases. What's the rundown on their performance this year, Jane?
From Oklahoma Genetics, we had Gallagher. Gallagher did best in the central region of the performance tests. Iba was slightly below the test average where it was entered. Double Stop CL Plus did best in the central and south central regions. Ruby Lee was best in the southeast. Bentley did well. It was good in the south central region of the test. Lone Rider, one of those that was stretched a little bit beyond its area of adaptation, but it was a top yielder in the north central, northwest, and irrigated trials this year. Spirit Rider did best in the south central region. Smith's Gold was slightly below the test average. It did a little better in the south central region. The white wheat Stardust was below the test average in south central where it was entered. And the experimental OK 12716 was mentioned as a top yielder in the central region, and I understand it is due to be released probably this week and named, hopefully.
So producers who are interested in that particular variety out of Oklahoma could be looking for that, as well as the others out of that program. And the Colorado varieties, again, largely for the High Plains region of western Kansas. What did we see in their performance?
Langen was the best in South Central and better in dryland as opposed to irrigated trials. It was pretty low in the western irrigated trials. Bird did the best in the Southwest region. Avery did well in the Northwest and Southwest regions. Brawl CL did a little bit better in the Northwest. And Denali was about equally good in the Northwest and Southwest. And an experimental from Plains Gold, CO13D1783, was a top yielder in the Central region.
And you did have that one lone variety out of the Nebraska breeding program. It, too, is an experimental, but it did show fairly well in one part of the state anyway, you say.
It did. This was NE 10478-1. It did well in the central parts of the state. It was the best in the north central, not surprisingly, but did pretty well where it was entered.
We share all of this, Jane, because you encourage producers to scan the entire spectrum of varieties available in the region, for they may find that there are others outside of their normal circle of varieties that could perform well for them.
That's right. And again, be sure to keep the environmental conditions in mind when examining the test results from K-State or Colorado, if you check that out. And also be mindful of your own conditions when selecting a wheat variety. This year, the main issues affecting wheat production were uneven precipitation patterns, droughts, definitely, and cold weather. So more information relating to winter survival, disease, and grain quality is available online at agronomy, that's agronomy.kstate.edu, or in the hard copy of the 2018 Wheat Seed Book.
And it will be, again, available as an insert out of that publication very soon.
That's right, in the High Plains Journal. And also a digital version of the book can be found at ksre.ksu.edu/bookstore. And the wheat seed directory portion can be found at kscrop.org.
It was a unique growing season 2018 for winter wheat in Kansas, and the information as we close out, Jane, is important and useful, even though this wasn't the best of crops. Producers can get something out of the data for sure, right?
Definitely, but hopefully not to be repeated anytime soon.
Very good. Congratulations to you and your team for once again bringing all of this together in report form, which serves as a tremendous reservoir of information for our wheat growers heading into another planting season, not at all long from now. So thank you for coming over and spending a few moments with us.
Well, thank you.
The agronomist in charge of K-State's crop performance tests, which would include the wheat trials all around the state, Jane Lingenfelser. They had 21 sites in Kansas established, 19 were actually harvested, and a wealth of information on these varieties and how well they did in this report. As she noted, several ways to access it. And if you have any questions, do contact your local Extension agricultural agent likewise. They can walk you through what the report has to say about wheat variety performance prospects for your region of Kansas. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. We'll break away now and then return with a recap of today's agricultural news headlines and this week's edition of Milk Lines. K-State's Mike Brouk standing by. Plus more still ahead here on the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here, and time now for a quick glance to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. The USDA posting its weekly Kansas crop progress and condition report late yesterday. And for the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies in the state at 3% surplus, 58% adequate, and 39% still short to very short. Subsoil moisture, 2% surplus, 56% adequate, and 42% short to very short. The condition of the Kansas corn crop this week, 48% good to excellent, 29% fair, 23% poor to very poor. Corn silking, now at 96%. That's fairly close to the 5-year average. Corn in the dough stage at 65%. That's ahead of the 48% average. And dented corn at 23%. That is well ahead of the 7% average for this date. Soybean crop condition at 43% good to excellent, 36% fair, 21% poor to very poor. Soybeans now blooming at 89%, ahead of the 75% average, and soybeans setting pods 63%, well ahead of the 38% average. And the condition of the Kansas grain sorghum crop at 62% good to excellent, 30% fair, 8% poor to very poor. Sorghum now headed at 58%. The average is 42%. And sorghum coloring at 6%. The average for the date at 3%. And range and pasture conditions then in Kansas are at 29% good to excellent, 36% fair, and 35% poor to very poor. For the national numbers on the corn and soybean crop conditions, we turn now to the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Declines in condition ratings this week for many crops: corn, soybeans, cotton, sorghum, and spring wheat. Not necessarily from weather over this past week.
But actually, especially in some of the driest and drought-affected areas, we're seeing more visible impacts from earlier problems that are now coming to light.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey for corn, the good to excellent category down 1% to 71, poor to very poor up 1% to 10%, the most dramatic downturn for corn in Missouri.
And again, I think a lot of the damage was done earlier when it was hotter and drier, and now we're seeing 44% of the corn acreage rated very poor to poor. That's up a very sharp 13 percentage points from a week ago.
And for the nation's soybean crop,
a slightly greater decline. We're now at 67% good to excellent and 10% very poor to poor.
A loss of 3% from the good to excellent category, 2% more rated poor to very poor. Meanwhile, corn and soybean development still ahead of average. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
And nationally, grain sorghum 69% headed as of Sunday. That's ahead of the average of 62%. And sorghum coloring at 31%, equal to the 5-year average. The sorghum crop condition across the nation at 49% good to excellent. That was down 3 percentage points from 52% the previous week. And National Economic Council Director Lawrence Kudlow told reporters that the U.S. and China have been talking. Talks have stalled, but in recent days, he reports, there has been some communication for the first time in a good while at the highest levels. U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and President Xi's economic envoy Liu He and their teams have been in conversations about a possible meeting, but the talks remain at a preliminary stage. Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of Milk Lines. And standing by with that is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning preparing for winter. I know it's the middle of the summer and we're probably all tired of heat stress and things that go with that, but it is time to maybe start thinking about some things concerning winter in our dairy farms. And we have some long-range forecasts that are indicating that we might have a winter that is wetter than normal and also maybe even cooler than normal. So the need for bedding on our dairies is likely to go up. You couple this with the fact that straw production was down this year in the state of Kansas, we may be scrambling for supplies of bedding as we look into the winter time. So now is the time to get ready. So I want you to carefully think about some things. If you're operating a dry lot dairy or if you have heifers or dry cows out on dry lot, I One of the big things we can do to reduce the amount of bedding that we need in those areas is to make sure that we have adequate drainage. So some things to pay attention to are, do you have areas in those pens where water collects? If so, are animals exposed to those collection areas, and can we reduce the amount of area that those water collection areas might require? If we can do that, we can likely reduce the amount of mud that animals are exposed to, thus reducing the amount of bedding that we might need to keep them dry and comfortable. Secondly, look at your roof lines that drain into dry lot areas, especially as you think about shades and other structures that might be associated with those pens. Do you have gutters? If not, where does the drainage go that comes off those roof lines? If that goes into the total pen, that means it will create mud, which will likely increase the amount of bedding that you might need. So if you can reduce the amount of moisture that's draining into the pen, that will greatly reduce the amount of bedding that you have to use in an extended winter that is wet. You probably need to keep in mind that you probably need about 50 square feet per animal if we're talking about mature animals that is bedded to provide adequate bedding during the winter time or during very inclement weather. So what about the types of bedding that you might be able to use in those areas? Traditionally, we have used straw. However, straw may be in short supply or could be very expensive this year compared to previous years. So what are some other alternatives that we might have? Corn stalks can be an alternative. Doesn't absorb as much moisture as what straw would, but again, it can help build a base. You could use a base that included corn stalks and then come back with a layer of straw to increase the comfort level of the animals. As you think about how you might do this, keep in mind that your stalks, if you use corn stalks, they may require different processing equipment than what you typically have used for straw. So plan ahead, making sure that you have the equipment available you need if that's going to be your choice. The other thing you need to keep in mind that if you're going to choose to utilize stalks, making sure that you secure access to those supplies now is probably pretty important. Also making sure that you have people available to do the harvesting that will be needed to get those to your farm. One last note, as you look about at the need for bedding on your farm, keep in mind that your small calves need the ability to nest in good bedding. Straw is probably the preferred thing to use for your calves. So if you're in short supply, you might want to make sure you reserve straw for the calves and then consider other types of bedding for your more mature animals. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to begin planning for the winter season.
Thanks, Mike, and we'll be back shortly on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Now for you in Agriculture Today, another visit with wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension on another facet of wildlife management. Today, Charlie will illustrate the comeback of the swift fox in the Plains region, including Kansas, and this after some years of decline, you say.
Yes, the distribution of swift fox in the western Great Plains has been severely reduced from what it was in historic times. The swift fox was extirpated from Canada in the 30s. In the early 1900s, in the United States, the swift fox was also considered extirpated from Montana, North Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, with very few in some of the other states, primarily South Dakota, Colorado, and New Mexico. But since then, swift fox populations have been able to recover gradually and are certainly not abundant, but now being reintroduced in some of those areas where they had disappeared. The swift fox is a very unique prairie specialist. It's native to short grass and mixed grass prairies. There's been some fossil records of swift fox from eastern Missouri and in Iowa, even some in Minnesota. So I don't expect it was ever very abundant in those locales, but has been documented there. It was a very abundant predator on the prairies, and it's a very unique and interesting animal to observe. They're out a lot in the daytime. They're very playful, commonly found in and around prairie dog colonies. But there's been a lot of work trying to figure out what are the factors that caused swift fox to be decimated in numbers.
And one of those factors, which was the subject of a recent study, the interaction with coyotes.
Yeah, the recent research shows that the main cause of mortality among swift fox is predation from coyotes. Certainly there were other human-induced factors that led to the reduction in numbers, including some inadvertent poisoning as a result of predator reduction campaigns that were widespread. There was probably some trapping pressure and even rodent control programs that reduced the food supply. But I think probably the main one, at least here in Kansas, would have been the conversion of rangeland to cropland. That certainly changed the habitat and probably led to the reduction of swift fox.
Talk more about this research out of Texas Tech, which tried to gauge the impact of coyotes on swift fox, the predation and the competition for food, you say.
Well, researchers from Texas Tech University radio-marked and monitored swift fox and coyotes at 2 study sites. On one study site, coyotes had a relatively high abundance. They measured that with an index that included fecal counts, and there were 6 scats that were counted in a 2-kilometer area, which would be just a little under 1 mile. The survival of those coyotes was good in that site. Survival of swift fox was pretty good in that site. But swift fox were about a third as abundant as coyotes on that particular site, and killings by coyotes were pretty high. The recruitment of young, meaning young per adult, into the next year's population was very low, as recorded at only 0.25. The other site was slightly different, but on the other site they decided to remove coyotes. They removed 227 coyotes on the other study site and found coyote abundance decreased by about a third. The swift fox increased survival by threefold, and they increased density as well. They increased recruitment rates. It was a factor of 4, so it went from 0.25 young being recruited each year to 1.2, and the mortality factor went down by 3 as direct mortality from coyotes. So it looks like as a result of that work that if you remove enough coyotes from an area that you might increase swift fox survival. But coyotes kill swift fox for several reasons, not just as a direct competitor, as another canine, another predator for the food resource, but perhaps they also are competitors for food. Another study done again by Texas Tech looked at food habits, found that they were very similar between coyotes and swift fox, and it looks like the same items that they consume, but they consume those at different times of the year. And, of course, when you look at a swift fox that may only be 7 to 10 pounds in size, compare that to a coyote that's maybe 4 times that size, the size of the prey items differs as well. But there was certainly a high dietary overlap between coyotes and swift fox, so that means there's competition for food resources, and certainly coyotes are taking swift fox out of the population for reasons other than food, because coyotes kill swift fox but seldom consume them, so they're getting rid of competition.
So the question remains, can swift fox and coyotes coexist in the prairie ecosystem?
Well, I think they can. They are doing quite well. We have good populations of swift fox now. We have high populations of coyotes. It just depends on the changes in the habitat, and I suspect over time either one of these predators are adaptable enough to survive for the foreseeable future.
But it is a success story, Charlie, in the recovery of the swift fox?
Yes, I would consider it a success story. We've found that swift fox populations that in locations that were extirpated have been able to come back and persist quite well.
It's an interesting story, a rebound of a species in many areas where it had dwindled over time, the recovery of the swift fox, and some interesting information likewise on its interaction with coyotes in the wild. And Charlie, we appreciate the word, as always. Charlie Lee, Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. That caps off our Tuesday edition as we part today to remind you about our podcast version of the broadcast. To listen to that, visit agtoday.net, or using your podcast app on your mobile device, you can type in the keywords Agriculture Today Kansas. You'll find the program. Just tap the subscribe button there, and brand new episodes of our program will automatically arrive on your device every weekday. Your starting point, agtoday.net. Meantime, thanks for tuning in right here today, and please rejoin us this same time tomorrow. Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.